Welcome to Behind the Bricks with Peter Vonderay.
Mitch, welcome to Behind the Bricks.
How you doing?
Thank you. This is a special episode where we are calling it our monthly market talk, our MMT, where we basically take a 10-minute dive into one particular subject. And big news in New York City multifamily housing is the upcoming changes to the rent stabilization, rent regulation laws. So maybe you can start off with, and before we start, also, I want to say we're sitting here with my associate, Danny Handweiler.
Hello.
So welcome.
Thank
you. Mitch, why don't you start us off with a little bit of summary? These laws are going to change in June. And why don't you set the landscape for us? What is essentially happening?
You know, one of the reasons why I wanted to come and speak with you guys today is that there's a lot of hysteria in the marketplace as to what's going to happen. You know, people predicting the end of the ability to develop buildings in the multifamily market and what have you. And all of that is kind of silly.
Yeah.
These things are cyclical and we're in a cycle. There have been other eras in our history where both houses were controlled by the Democrats and, very pro-tenant legislation was passed. But it's very important to separate the wheat from the chaff as to what's really going on here.
Yeah. And you're basically saying there is a lot of noise that happens.
That's correct.
Around a subject like this when these are changing.
That's correct. The first thing to really understand is the politics of it. Okay. And the politics really revolve around the fact that there are a number of new senators or assembly people that are chest beating for their constituents right now because it was the platforms upon which they were elected. Hence, you have a lot of bills that are propounded by a lot of people who are new to New York State, to the legislators,
right?
Who are propounding bills that don't have a chance of really being passed, or they're really dredging up old bills that were defeated on many occasions by the Senate when it was controlled by the Republicans.
Right. So this subject becomes a platform for people to get a little press. And hey, you put us in office, and now we're known. Just to let you guys know, we're actually trying to make things happen. And essentially,
that's correct.
Yeah.
And the people to watch and to listen to what they say are more the senior leaders in either the Senate or the Assembly,
right? Because
they have more oversight into what ultimately gets done. And you have to understand that it's a three-part system up there. Ultimately, the Senate and the Assembly will have to produce a bill that Governor Cuomo is going to sign.
Right.
And although on the surface he says, he certainly is not overtly pro-landlord, but the bottom line is that he has his own agenda, and he understands, just as I think many of the senior members of the Assembly and the Senate understand, that swinging too far to the left is ultimately going to create an economic situation which is not good for anybody.
Right.
But having them say that in the public is another thing.
Yes.
I mean, Heastie, who is the Speaker of the Assembly, made some public comments in March, which I really believe ring true as to what's actually going to happen with the laws. And he was really beaten down, by the newer members of the Assembly.
Yeah, as being too moderate or something like that. So the business as we know it started with legislation that occurred in 1997, which had been altered a few times, but more significantly in 2011, and then in 2015, and each of those times with kind of 4-year renewals. So now we're sitting here in June of 2019, and what is really set to change, I guess, if and I know that as you said, there's a plethora of bills up there, but if you had to highlight like the main issues, what is on the table for landlords to be aware of?
Well, I would actually go back before those eras to the ATPA of 1974, which is more akin to the sweeping revisions that we're going to see today, revising the rent control and rent stabilization laws.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think that you should probably look more at that as a model than
1997,
than recent legislations. But the bottom line is, it's not going to take me long to discuss with you the major areas that ultimately will be changed. And I don't think it's going to be on a per bill basis. They're ultimately going to have a significant piece of legislation like the Omnibus Housing Act of 1983, which was the most significant in the recent past, that's going to hit a lot of different areas and modify a lot of different things. And some of these concepts will be woven into that legislation and some of them won't be.
Right.
What I think you're going to see is that you're going to see vacancy decontrol curbed to some extent.
Right.
If it's not eliminated all, entirely, there will be a much higher limit as to when apartments become deregulated, other than the 2,700 plus.
Right.
Today 2,733, whatever the number is.
Yeah,
you're going to see that
today, Danny. If you want to decontrol an apartment, the law works how?
You have to get the legal rent above the threshold with 2733 or 2766.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So you think the first impact is that decontrol number from going from regulated, essentially stabilized to free market, is either going to be significantly increased or it may be done away with entirely.
Yes, and you have to remember when you're looking through all these proposed changes is that these rent control or rent regulatory statutes are in derogation of the common law, so that they have to, in order to be justified and withstand constitutional challenge, they can't, there has to be a genuine housing shortage that they're addressing. So the higher the rents go that they're trying to regulate, the less of a housing shortage there is, and the more difficult it is for them to ultimately pass legislation which would withstand a challenge at some point in time. And everybody knows that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Well, yeah. The thinking behind it, from a technical standpoint, is fundamentally flawed. Is what you're saying. So one is, okay, the ability to take apartments out of stabilization into free market, that's going to change significantly, right, and either go away or become much more difficult. What about raising rents?
Well, I think the vacancy bonuses, which is currently at 20% for a 2-year lease and less of that based upon the differential between the current RGBO guidelines, will change significantly also. I think everybody believes that they will be reduced in half to about 10% max,
right,
for a 2-year lease and less than that for a 1-year vacancy lease.
For listeners who don't know what we're talking about here, Danny, what's he referring to when he's talking about the vacancy increases in terms of raising the rents?
I believe you're talking about when a rent stabilized tenant vacates the unit, right?
That's correct.
And they've been there for X amount of years. Depending on how much time they've been there, you get an automatic bonus when they vacate the apartment. So You're saying 20% is going to go away. It's probably going to be closer to 10%.
Yeah.
The next area that probably will have some overhaul is in the area of preferential rents. With respect to this, there are a lot of rent-regulated apartments where there's a 2-tier system in place, where there's the legal regulated rent and there's a lesser rent that's being charged to the current rent-regulated tenant based upon an agreement. And the law as it exists today says that after that, if the agreement is worded right and the registrations are done properly, that the rent can go up to the legal regulated rent. And I think what you're going to see is a provision that basically does not allow that anymore.
Right.
That for existing rent-regulated tenants that do have preferential rents, they will override any agreement, and they'll say that tenant only receives increases pursuant to his preferential rent, regardless of any agreement to the contrary. However, I think you'll see that when that tenant vacates, that the owner will then be able to bump the rent up to the legal regulated rent and get vacancies based on that.
Yeah, so that temporary preferential rent which used to be, owners used to be able to remove that preferential rent at any time during lease expiration. Now it's going to be, while that tenant is in place, you have to stick with that preferential rent.
That's right.
And this business plan we see more in areas such as, Upper Manhattan, the Bronx, parts of Brooklyn and Queens. We don't see the preferential rent come into the business plan as much as, for owners who are doing it in Manhattan. The other main category, I would say, would be the rental increases based on work you do.
That's right.
Right.
I mean, there is going to be some sort of overhaul in the individual apartment improvement sector, which allows you to basically raise rents by certain percentages for work done in an apartment, either while that rent regulated tenant is in occupancy,
right,
with their written consent, or afterwards. And currently, for units that are 35 or less, it's 1/40th, and above that, it's 1/60th. I think that those percentages will change, to some other number, and they may also limit the categories in which you can get an individual apartment improvement increase. The same thing for MCIs. I think that they may limit the amount of further limit the amount of MCI increase that you can get,
the type of work that apply that
and also the category of work that might apply. And they may say that it's not a permanent increase to the rent, but basically dies off at some point in time. With respect to the IIs, I'm not sure whether it's 35 or 36 units. I know you're quoting me, but
it's 36.
Right.
Yeah. Look, a lot of this is the actual provisions themselves are not complicated, but there's so many of them that layer on top of each other, and they all have numbers and time frames and all that kind of stuff. But overall, when I think about the impact on this in terms of business and operations, all of these measures, if they are altered in the way that you've suggested, they essentially are making the business less profitable, and from a real 30,000 foot view, are discouraging additional capital to be invested into these assets, into housing in New York City. What do you think?
Well, I think they're changing the playing field so that you have to understand, if you're a developer, what the rules and regulations are, so that you can put together a plan, an economic plan, which is going to give you an anticipated return. It's very important while you look at these changes to formulate your plan to whatever in front of you. I think there are some others which I'll touch on, which I think are important for your listeners to know about.
Yeah.
I think that the statutes of limitations are going to be altered on overcharges, either in length from 4 years to maybe another number. I think that you don't get that there may be some legislation which says that you don't get the benefit of the statute of limitation unless you do something, i.e. that you notify a tenant of his rights in a certain manner.
Wow.
I think
now,
that...
Can I stop you there? Because I see this as significant in that when we see new investors buying buildings and you're looking to verify and do your diligence, they, in the back of their head, although this can be pierced by fraud and all this type of stuff, they, in the back of their head, they kind of have this, well, if they have the 4-year number in their head of like, okay, well, maybe if I have great information for 4 years, I'm okay, and I'm more willing to accept some level of risk. And you're saying that statute of limitations of 4 years may change. And if so, that changes the nature of how investors here do due diligence.
Right. I would say to your listeners that because of the fungible definition of the word fraud, that if you're prudent and you're doing due diligence in a prudent manner, that you're actually going beyond that 4 years in any event, and making sure that your apartment is properly deregulated under a lot of different circumstances. The record keeping provision of the code right now is that you only have to keep 4 years worth of records. And I don't understand if they're going to lengthen the limitations period to 6 years, how they get around that. Maybe it's prospective only,
right,
and not retroactive. But I think that the main change in the limitation period is when that limitation period starts to run.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's what you're going to see. I'm also thinking, we talked about all these different increases that impact the rent. And I think that they are contemplating, and you may see an overall blanket cap from whatever source of all of these things and how they interact on the rents from tenant to tenant. I know that it's being discussed, and it's being discussed by members of the legislature that are not the newer ones. So I look at some credence to that.
Do you mean if we combine the vacancy increase, the individual apartment
with the longevity, which we haven't discussed, which I don't think is going to change?
Right. So you combine all these, and they say, hey, under all circumstances, an apartment's rent can't increase more than X if you combine everything together. So putting it's almost like a governor on that aspect of the business.
I think that you may see that. I also think that there is certainly going to be increased vigilance with respect to penalties and fines for violating the code.
Yes.
I think you're going to see that. And there's already a criminal piece of legislation, which I don't like, which has been signed, unlike all these other things which are still in committee, by both houses. That's going to the desk of the governor, I'd urge him not to sign it. That basically makes harassment of a rent-regulated tenant either a felony or a misdemeanor. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that there's something very wrong with the definitional framework on what constitutes harassment, and it needs to be looked at further. For example, there's a flyer in there that says that if you commence good faith litigation, it can't be considered harassment. That's the first situation that I've heard of where you can be punished with a crime in America for starting a piece of litigation.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to accept good faith, then that means as a corollary that bad faith litigation, whatever that means, may be subject to you to a crime. That's silly.
Right.
And the standards for that, if you're going to do something that serious and basically bring in the lawyers as possibly bad actors and possibly have criminal liability for participating in this harassment, then I think you better take a long, sobering look at the legislation and figure out what you're doing and what you're not doing. The other thing that I think is important that doesn't get us discussed a lot, which my gut tells me based upon my long experience in pieces of rent registrations, is I think that in reality, there's going to be a piece of it that attempts to re-regulate apartments which have been previously deregulated. I think you're going to see something in the new law that basically states that apartments that have been deregulated maybe in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years and have not rented for a X amount, are going to be brought back into the fold, at rents that were charged as of January 1 of this year.
Wow.
Now, why do I think that? I think that because I'm a student of prior historical legislation and how the pendulum swings. And if that's the case, then my best advice to owners right now is that if you have vacant apartments, keep them vacant. For that reason and for all the other reasons that we articulated, until such time as we, have a lot more clarity on what's going to happen. Because it would be a shame that you spent a lot of money on a unit with the anticipation of charging X dollars per month. Then all of a sudden this legislation is enacted and your ability to charge that amount is severely impaired and you haven't invested your capital wisely.
Yeah.
There are a lot of other methodologies of developing a building, these provisions, which if people speak with me, I can talk to them individually because it's an apartment by apartment. It's a building by building analysis.
There's so many different
and there
scenarios.
Better way. Yeah. There may be a better way and a better mousetrap. A mousetrap's not a good word either. There might be a better scenario,
strategy,
or strategy to develop your building.
Look, that's if you're talking about the possibility of taking units that are currently free market and re-regulating them, that is a fundamental change in the industry that I think would have very wide-ranging effects, not only in the actual application of the business, but I think there's a PR component of this that all of these pieces of legislation communicate to investors, to people who are buying, to people who are selling. This is the temperature level of the kitchen that you are walking into. And so there's other messaging that I think is communicated beyond just the actual operations of the buildings. Danny, after listening to all that, what do you think in terms of how this all impacts owners and buyers, from your conversations with people in the community?
Sure. Well, clearly there's a lot of question marks right now. Problem with question marks is that it creates obviously uncertainty, which just gives pause to the market, right? So a lot of our usual suspects, guys who've been historically some of our best buyers, our most active groups, oftentimes are syndicators, right? And they're buying properties where they can kind of go in there and implement a business plan within at least the first 12 to 24 months. They're saying, hey, I don't know exactly what I'm buying into right now because I don't know where the laws are going to go.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what I should do and how to underwrite a business plan, how to value this real estate and where I'm going to be able to take it.
So that buyer group's off the table. Who is buying them?
Who is buying? A lot of generational real estate holders here in New York, wealthy families, long-term owners.
Yeah. Which has always been the stable part of the market. And
exactly. And they're saying, like, to piggyback on what Mitch said earlier, which is, hey, this is all happening right now, but part of it's cyclical, right? The real estate market itself is cyclical, and then you have politics, which are also cyclical. So if I can buy a fully rent stabilized building at a decent return, let's say a 4 cap, the 4.5 cap that I'm talking about below 96th Street, but the basis is good, and I'm going to hold it for 30, 40, 50 years, I'm not so worried about what's happening today. I don't care what's happening in June, right? Because my outlook is so long-term.
Yeah,
Inherent in what you've said is that there might definitely going to be a price adjustment.
Well, I will say I agree. However, back to let's say the syndicator group of investors, they have already priced the uncertainty into their underwriting. So they're kind of saying, hey, I'm going to assume the worst. Let's assume the pendulum swings all the way to the left, right? Which it will or will not. And I have to write my offers today based on that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, sellers have to understand as well, which is sometimes the more trying aspect of it.
Correct.
In terms of timing, the laws are set to sunset in June 15th.
Correct.
But my belief is, like with every piece of major rent legislation that's occurred recently, you're going to see extender votes around that time, because I don't believe they're going to be able to roll out the new law in any way, shape, or form by June 15th. I think that they're going to push it for weeks or maybe a month or 2 or 3 until they finally get something that everyone can agree on.
Yeah, because just all the provisions that you just mentioned, there are so many moving parts that have interplay with each other, and to pull them all together around the same time, we're now sitting here pretty close to June 15th itself. You're saying that to pull that all together, it may not happen on time. And this, everyone who's waiting around saying, okay, I have no clarity now. As Danny says, I have question mark now. June 16th, I will have clarity. You're saying it may not happen at that date.
Yeah, I mean, the assembly hearings are not ending until May 10th, and the Senate hearings, are just getting ramped up and won't end until May 23rd. And I just don't believe that there will be consensus reached with coherent legislation
with respect
being
to that.
written,
Yeah.
By June 15th. I find that to be doubtful. But I think that probably after the Senate hearings end on May 23rd,
Mm-hmm.
they will get a much better idea of where we're going, although I don't anticipate that ultimately the bill will fall too far away from my remarks today.
Right. Well, Mitch, how long have you been doing this? Specializing in
since 1979.
1979.
So quite some time.
Yeah. So you've seen the legislation swings, you've seen the market swings. Is there a website where people can find you online if they want to reach out to you?
Well, I'd rather give you my spin website than my law firm website.
Yeah.
But my law firm website is KossoffPLLC.com.
Okay.
We invite you to call so that we can give you more of our novel development ideas,
Yes.
given what's on the table prospectively for the changes in the rent laws, because my belief is that there's always a way to try to develop your building successfully. You just need to know what the rules are. And of course, you need to play by them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, you've been very helpful to us on many transactions trying to navigate exactly what you just said. I think all of this stuff that's happening actually is a tremendous opportunity for injecting a little creativity into making things happen, which is what you referenced. So, Danny, Mitch, thanks a lot on this deep dive on Behind the Bricks.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Hey guys, it's Peter again. Hope you like the show. If you want any more information on the episode, go to www.behindthebricks.com. That's Behind the Bricks, all spelled out. And also, if you like what we're doing here, please hit the subscribe button. That's a little way to let us know that we are on the right track. So go out there, make something happen today, and thanks for coming Behind the Bricks.